You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Megan Reitz. She's listed on the Thinkers50 Radar of Global Management Thinkers and on the 2018 HR Most Influential list of thinkers. Reitz is the author of the new book Speak Up, as well as Dialogue in Organizations and Mind Time, and is a professor of leadership and dialogue at Hult Ashridge Executive Education. She's an international speaker, coach, and consultant, and her work focuses on the intersection of leadership, change, dialogue, and mindfulness. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Megan Reitz. Megan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So you have a book that just came out called Speak Up. It's a really interesting take on employee voice and all those dynamics, which we will get into. So just glad that you're here to talk about it.
Thank you.
Let's start with a high-level question. Why don't people speak up?
Well, this is a growing issue in business, and I think you probably, if you read the headlines, you can see how many issues it creates in organizations. Silence is sort of costing organizations quite a lot. People are staying quiet about stuff that's going on that shouldn't be going on, but also they're keeping ideas that organizations really need to themselves. And I suppose a key message that comes out of my research is that we tend to turn towards the people that are staying silent, and we say to them, come on, be brave, speak up, have courage. Mm-hmm. I know, here's a workshop you can go on. That'll make you brave. And that is important. That's a really, a reason why people aren't speaking up is because they may lack confidence or may lack the forums and capacities to speak up. But mainly people stay quiet because they fear the risk of speaking. And so there is an enormous responsibility on leaders and managers in particular to listen well. People don't speak up unless there's somebody listening. So that's an aspect that I focus on quite a lot in my research.
All right, so let's take a look at this. So what are some of the risks that someone perceives when they're in a situation that internally they're thinking in their head, I really should say something about this, I have something important to say, and then they opt to stay quiet? Mm-hmm. What is the risk that they see themselves taking on?
The top two risks that prevent people speaking up tend to be the fear of being perceived negatively, and then the fear of upsetting the other person. So essentially, we're social animals. We want to belong to a community and to our organization and our team, for example. And speaking up is often perceived by us to have more risks than rewards. And one great question that we ask when we go inside organizations in our what we call ethnographic studies, so there's kind of looking at case studies, we ask people, what do you think will happen if you speak up round here? And it's a fascinating question. And generally, people are concerned that it will affect how they are perceived, or as I said, it will affect others that they're speaking to negatively, and that will lead to them being rejected in one way or another.
Okay, and so have you found, are these risks substantiated? So if someone speaks up, do they really run the risk of being perceived as being, let's say, stupid or embarrassing the person that they're talking to?
Yeah, the risks are real, and we know ourselves how we judge other people when they speak up. So yes, the risks are absolutely real. We do have a tendency to catastrophize. So what we found in our research is that people imagine the risks to probably be greater than they certainly need to be. And there are quite a few things that people can do to mitigate risks. And the other thing I would say is that stories matter inside the organization. So one example, we went into an organization and I asked that question, what happens if you speak up around here? And the response was, if you speak up around here, you disappear, which is rather dramatic.
Huh.
But when you dig into this story, it actually came from an instance that happened 7 years ago with a different chief executive, when somebody had challenged him in a public meeting, and indeed this person was no longer at the organization the following week. And obviously they didn't actually know whether this person had already resigned, and that's why they spoke up in the first place. But my point is that we can listen to stories that may not be actually real or relevant anymore, but they are significant enough to still stop us in our tracks. So
right, because that ties into organizational culture, right? And part of the rituals and stories that we tell are a reflection of who we are and who we become. And so it doesn't even matter what the reality was of that story from 7 years prior. The story endures, and then that creates a culture where people feel like, oh, we can't speak up. And the second thing is that examples are really poignant. This is why universities or the military organizations will fire somebody as an example. If they want to set a new culture, they can take a draconian step if they want to stop things in their tracks.
Yeah. Yes, and it can be used and have a variety of different consequences. Unfortunately, in some ways, we tend to pay attention to negative stories more than positive stories. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, there's really good research that backs that up. That negative statements are more poignant in our mind than positive statements.
Yeah, and they're far more interesting to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunate from a leader's perspective that 9 times out of 10, as a leader, you can be really fabulous in terms of helping people to speak up and responding well when they do. But that 10th time, when you're particularly stressed and you're having a really bad day and you happen to sort of shout somebody down, that's the story that's then repeated, and that silences others.
Right. So one of the things that I find interesting in this stream of research is that it ties into what we call in organizational behavior agency theory, which is the idea that principals and agents often have different incentives. So ideally in any organization, the people who work there, their interests are as closely aligned with whether it's the shareholders or the board, whatever the goals are, that they should be as closely aligned as possible. But often that those things diverge. And so we see that a lot with not wanting to speak up. So, for example, for an individual who's sitting in a board meeting, they have 2 things that they want to do, right? They certainly want to help the company, but their private incentive more than anything is to keep their job. And those can often be at odds, right? So it's best for the company if people have a free range of ideas, free floating conversations with a back and forth where people are able to voice their opinion however they see fit. But for the individuals, usually superseding that idea is that they'd like to keep their job and do not want to fear and do not want to risk losing it. So how do you think of kind of these tensions that agency theory presents in terms of speaking up versus staying silent?
Well, I mean, what I would say is it's very complex and contextual. So although, yes, somebody wants to keep their job, people have different experiences about where speaking up sits within that. And you get some people that think keeping their job means that they should speak up because they have the experience that is a good thing. So it's slightly more complex. Similarly, it's more complex saying that an organization wants people to speak up. It certainly does in many, many ways, but in other ways, actually, it doesn't want people to speak up. So
but it's in their best interest. Sorry, I should have framed it this way. It's often in an organization's best interest to have people speaking up.
Yes. The reason why I'm pausing is that I'm looking at the moment at employee activism, and there's some organizations really grappling whether it's a good thing or not when people speak up. But yeah, broadly speaking, in terms of keeping in check malpractice and getting people's ideas and innovation, it is, it's something that a lot of organizations right now are seeking to do. Or
even if you're dealing with a really complex decision, whether to go into a new market or not, let's say overseas, just having the CEO's perspective is really not valuable.
You need more than that. Yeah. Exactly. So most boards and leadership teams, I mean, and certainly in leadership theory, we're shifting from the idea that it's useful to have some sort of heroic leader that has all the answers and they set the direction and through charisma allow everybody else to follow them, moving far more into facilitative relational leadership where the leadership act is to gain multiple perspectives, to actively invite multiple perspectives so that better decision making happens. But of course, that's far trickier than it actually sounds.
Of course. So how can somebody speak up without taking on undue risk? And how do they assess the risk of speaking up?
Okay. So bearing in mind that most of my work would say that actually we should put far more responsibility on the people that are perceived to have power to make it less risky to speak up. Bearing that in mind, and we must come back to that because I don't want it to sound like it's in the individual's lap to mitigate all the risks. I don't think it is. But if you're sitting there wanting to speak up, there's a number of things that get in the way, and there's a number of things to mitigate risk. Firstly, I mean, many of us, in the book, I go through these three things in particular. Many of us suffer a lack of confidence in the first place, and that's our perception of risk increases that. So we have what many of your listeners will know as imposter syndrome or imposter experience,
which we've all felt.
Absolutely,
it's pretty universal.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, and I have interviewed a few people that, frankly, could do with more imposter voice rather than less. But yes, it is fairly universal. So, one thing is to, in the first place, notice our thoughts around risk, and notice this brings in some of my research on mindfulness practice. So, our capacity to notice the stories that we have in our heads and the assumptions that we have about risks, and to be able to see them for what they are and critique them is a really, really important thing to do. The second thing is around really thinking about the other person when we're speaking up. The problem is when we speak up with something challenging, we're often so focused on ourselves and doing it right, and our adrenaline goes through the roof that we kind of blurt things out. Whereas what we really need to do is try and extend our attention and our empathy towards the person that we want to hear, and imagine, what language do I need to use to reach that person? When is the best time? Where? What do I need to say? And then rehearse as well. We interviewed a Royal Shakespeare Company director who was astounded in the organizational corporate world, the lack of rehearsal that happens before important announcements, but also before we speak up with important things. So that rehearsal alongside an ally or a sponsor or somebody that can give us feedback is absolutely invaluable, but most of us don't do it.
So how would you put yourself in the shoes of a supervisor before you approach them? What are the kinds of things that you would want to know as you're thinking about how they're going to respond?
So one of the first things is to ask, well, what's it like to be the supervisor? What pressure is the supervisor under? What objectives are they working to? What speaks to them? Because it may well be that the issue that you want to raise with them, you just need to put in their language. You need to put it in words where they kind of think, oh, right, this is actually really, really important. Let me give you an example. I interviewed a very good OD practitioner who was running a change transformation project at this organization. And he was describing how he went to visit the finance director to kind of sell in the change project and the program of communications and various things that they had in mind. And he said he kind of was really nervous about it. And so he launched in for about 10 minutes whilst the FD kind of sat there with his arms crossed and his eyebrow raised. And then at the end of the 10 minutes, the FD sort of looked at him and went, well, that's all very good, but we're facing an X million pound deficit that I have to clear in the next 6 months. How is this helping me?
Huh.
And it's just that kind of, and
Yeah.
the only practitioner was like, don't, of
Right.
course, I need to kind of think, what's it like to be the FD? What am I being told I have to do? What happens if I don't achieve it? Now, how does what I have to say link to some of those objectives and how that person is feeling and thinking about things?
It sounds like the recipe for a happy marriage.
That's a subject, but yes.
No, but I mean, like to think about what the other person is experiencing.
Yes.
Before just blurting into your own world. I mean, it's the challenge, which is that we are the stars of our own play or our own movie, and the only perception that we've ever had from birth until present point is our own perspective.
Yeah.
And it's really powerful to think about the world through the person that you're talking to, whether that in this case would be your supervisor, but a spouse as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we kind of all know this. We all know that it's a good idea, but when we're speaking up, and particularly when we're speaking up with something challenging, or we feel quite under pressure or emotional about what we speak up, our attention goes to ourselves. It doesn't tend to reach outwards to the other person, and that causes quite a few problems.
All right, let's take the other side of the coin. Let's think about this from the perspective of supervisors and organizations. What can they do to make it so that employees are empowered and more likely to be able to have a voice in a way that's productive?
Yeah. So what we know about senior individuals, but not just hierarchically senior, those people that are perceived to be powerful inside an organization, we know that we underestimate our own, what I call our own scariness. So I meet with many managers who really, really believe that they're approachable. And this is the first thing that we need to tackle, because although they may be absolutely lovely people and have really good intentions, that does not mean that other people won't find them scary. And it doesn't mean that they don't have to still work really, really hard to enable people to feel able to speak up.
So why are they intrinsically scary? Even if they're super nice, they never say anything that's off. They're not aggressive. They have open door policy. They're friendly. Yeah.
So when we communicate and interact with one another as human beings, we label each other consciously or unconsciously, and we label one another according to things like gender, age, ethnicity, job title, appearance, personality. And all of these titles and labels convey differing levels of status and authority depending on the context. And particularly with job title, but not just that, let's use that as an example. When somebody has the title of manager or director or leader, or even if they have the label of confident or high performer, it will mean to some others that they may feel intimidated, despite the fact that that person is really lovely and approachable. So it's worth remembering that others may find you intimidating just because of how you are or the position that you hold.
Okay, so if somebody has hierarchical power, what do they do beyond being nice to not be intimidating?
Well, so that is a massive first step, is to remember the effect that status and labels can have on other people speaking up to you. And I can't underline this enough. In our research, we found, this is important, the more senior you get, the more deluded, I'll use that word, the more deluded you are that others are speaking openly and freely to you.
Sure.
So that is the first thing we need to remember, that people are not talking to us as openly as we like to think that they are. Now, where do we go from that? It means that we have to, both in our verbal and non-verbal signals, we need to convey a genuine interest in people's opinions. So that brings me to the second thing. We need to kind of get real with ourselves. How interested are we in hearing from other people? And I think if we're totally honest with ourselves, we realize that we're interested about hearing certain things from certain people at certain times. And we're not actually open to hearing all sorts of things. So and people can hear and sense that straight away. If you're doing a tick box exercise on the let's get everybody's voice on in the room, but you're not actually doing anything with that, people suss that out straight away. So you need to watch your response to when you're challenged. And as I wrote in a recent HBR article, if you can't remember the last time you were really challenged well, that will probably tell you that you're properly scary. So,
that's a great line.
Think about your responses and think about the signals that you're sending out. And this is the other, I'll stop after this, but, many of us are unaware of the signals that we send out through our face and our body language that can, they're very subtle, but they can mean the difference between whether somebody says something or not. An errant eyebrow or a thinking face that looks suspiciously like a disapproving face.
It seems like an impossible task.
You know what? It is. It is alone probably is pretty difficult. I mean, I know in my research ways of training people to be far more aware of the signals that they're sending, and you can train it. You can train the brain through mindfulness and techniques to be far more aware of present moment signals. But essentially, you also need help from others. And there's an irony there, because if you ask other people to give you feedback, but you're in a scary position, they might not speak openly to you. So, but you need the support and coaching of others, and you need feedback.
So some of this ties into what we call in the management literature leader-member exchange. And so the basic idea is that you have leaders who have it just inherently within their group of subordinates, some people that are on the in-group and some people that are in the out-group, and that people in the in-group are going to be treated differently than those in the out-group. People in the in-group know they're in the in-group. People in the out-group know that they're in the out-group, and that it's one of the biggest challenges of leadership is to adjudicate that effectively and professionally.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, again, another label that I think is really important. It's actually a label that with one of my coachees at the moment, they're using quite a lot. So are you in the group or are you out the group? And people know that. And it hugely affects the decisions that people make about whether to speak up. And it affects who's being invited. So a question for leaders really is, are you trapped in an echo chamber? Are you listening? It's natural to turn to the same sorts of people for opinions. But look at the consequences of that, and whose voices are you not getting to hear that might be really, really vital and important to you. And I think, again, some of the scandals that we see in the newspaper are coming from people that listened only to certain voices and ignored others.
So we've talked about the nice supervisor. What happens with the supervisor who is more aggressive or even getting into abusive supervision? Is there any hope for them to change and to have a more inclusive work environment where people have a voice?
Well, I mean, I've seen examples of people changing and examples of people not changing. So I think, and it has tended to come down to whether those individuals, first of all, become aware of their own behavior, and secondly, have any motivation to change it. And I've personally worked with individuals that have been, verging on bullying behavior, but honestly have not seemed to realize the impact and effect that they've had, and then have been thoroughly shocked when they found out, and they've altered their behavior. But I've also worked with people that have had bullying behaviors, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they think that that's how they get results at work. And then, unless you can sort of work with them and persuade them and show them that that just simply isn't the case, then there are other measures, and it might be that organizations need to, try and work with feedback for those sorts of managers, but then after a while they need to show that it's not acceptable.
What kind of training can organizations provide for managers so that they can work on these issues? I'm now stepping away from the abusive supervision problem, but just more broadly, what can organizations do to support managers so that employees have voice?
So, many things, and there's the kind of training aspect, and there's also the processes and structures that you build within an organization that helps people to speak up and gives people forums and processes through which they speak up. But let me give you an example. I've been working with a leadership team at a professional services firm, and I've been working with them on what I call the Speaking Truth to Power project. So firstly, raising people's awareness of power and how perceptions of power are formed and affect what gets said. I do that alongside mindfulness training, which enables people to turn their attention towards the signals that they're sending, but also the processes within a team, and particularly around psychological safety in a team.
Can you describe psych safety?
Yeah, sure thing. So psychological safety, certainly refer to Amy Edmondson's fabulous work in this area. Psychological safety is essentially an individual's perceptions of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk. So in other words, do they feel confident to speak up about mistakes, or do they feel confident to ask questions or offer ideas? And that links very well with some of the work that I'm doing on what we call team mindfulness as well, and on the speaking up. So you're looking to train leaders in the capacity to be far more aware about themselves and the dynamic of the team, and in particular around practices and ways in which they can improve psychological safety. And one, part of that is all the stuff that I've been talking about, being understanding what signals they're sending, what responses happen when people speak up already. And then another thing is equipping them. I tend to train people in coaching skills as well, because part of this is, how do you frame the right questions that enable people to feel like they can speak up more safely? So again, a kind of an example is, picture the scene. You've got your new boss has just come in, and they've just given you a PowerPoint presentation about the new strategy. And there's the team sat around the table in silence looking at the strategy presentation. And the very well-meaning manager turns around, claps his hands, and kind of grins and says, "So, thoughts?" And there's this kind of silence around the table.
Right. It's just silent.
Turns around and says, "Right, you guys over there, put yourself in the position for the moment of a really critical customer. You guys over there, put yourself in the position of our top competitor. You guys over there, imagine you're a supplier, and you've all just seen that presentation. What would be the one challenge that you'd come up with from those positions?" So you're having you're likely to, not necessarily, it does depend on the culture, but you're likely to have a very different conversation in the latter than you would in the former. And a lot of that is just, do leaders and managers have a kind of toolkit around what to ask? There was a great one when I interviewed a manager, and he said that he asked his team, "What do you all know that I will never get to know, but really need to?" Which I think was, it's a complex question,
That's
but
a great question.
it gets to what you need to be able to reach, with the kind of questions that you're asking.
And some of this ties into the systems that are in place that trickles down into culture and psychological safety. The example that comes to mind for me is the Toyota production system, right? Where, in contrast with GM, Toyota had a system in the 80s, or that really became famous in the 80s, where employees were incentivized to stop the line and say that there's a problem. And you would they'd literally pull a chain, the entire line of cars would stop, and they'd say, I see a problem, we need to address this. And they would be incentivized to do that. And in contrast, at GM, they were infamous for that the line never stopped, no matter what. And so you can walk through those two systems and see how, in just implementing that one difference, how on down the line people are going to feel more comfortable saying, what about this? What about this? What about this? Can we put our attention towards this new area? And it should even get into individual relationships between managers and their subordinates.
And some great examples in the aviation industry and also in the medical profession of processes that enable and make it normal and, in fact, required for employees to speak up with issues, and for those in powerful positions to go through and expect that to happen. Again, Amy Edmondson talks quite a lot about that in some of her work as well.
Have you looked at some of the cultural differences? And I'm thinking that, right, in the United States, we have a pretty low power distance between lower power and higher power. We're a democratic country where all you see on, whether that's Twitter or on the news, is people constantly speaking truth to power and calling out issues at a very public forum. And we contrast that with many of the Eastern cultures that have higher power distances, so that it's less culturally appropriate to speak truth to power. Have you looked at some of the culture issues?
We have. So in our interviews, and in the survey that we've done, we have looked globally at different ways of and different approaches to speaking up. It is an area that I want to delve in more depth, because most of our research is, I would say, British European based. There is obviously a big element of cultural difference, particularly relating to power distance. What I would say, though, is that we can become a bit distracted by that, and we can start saying, well, in Sweden and Denmark, it's all flat. And I mean, there's this great rhetoric around organizations being flat now, and they're never flat.
Google was famous where they say Sergey Brin and Larry Page were effectively flat to other people, and that was, of course, never the case.
So you can turn to the most democratic country or organization, and okay, maybe the job title bit isn't perceived to carry the same expectations. But there's almost certainly other titles and labels that have come into play that still mean that there obviously is power difference, and that affects what people speak up about. And or you also find that, and I've done some work in some of the Scandinavian countries, again, that are egalitarian and that rightly pride themselves in having sort of a flatter hierarchical structure. But there's still what I call conversational habits. There's stuff that gets spoken about really freely, and there's still stuff that's more awkward to talk about. So for wherever you are in the world, it's a good idea to look at, well, hang on a second, how do we, I guess technically socially construct power here? What are the titles and labels that convey status and power? And we all have them. What are the consequences of that, and what are our conversational habits? What are we comfortable talking about, and what don't we tend to talk about that we really need to?
So I can say I had the experience was so different teaching over in China. I taught for 3 summers at a university in China, and I'm an in of one person's experience, but it was very difficult to get students to challenge my ideas. I gave up by the 3rd year, effectively. It was just not in the culture because I was the professor. Here, it's no problem. I mean, at my university, my students challenge what I'm saying all the time. I expect it. I encourage it. I really like it. And to turn to step into the Chinese culture, I found myself at least unable to make that happen.
Yeah, so that absolutely, and so wherever you go, there are different cultural norms and habits which you have to get to understand, and the question is, what do I need to know? What do I need to be able to invite? And what are the rules of the game, as I also call them? What are the rules of the game in this country or in this organization about how I get to hear these sorts of things?
Sure.
So if I need to hear challenge, in what way am I best able to do that within this particular culture? And it might not be that, you may determine, well, in this particular culture, I can't just ask people because they won't tell me. I have to work through others or other means in order to hear the voice from further down, if you like, further down the hierarchy.
Yeah, I found in China it's just much more subtle. You could do breakout groups. I mean, there's things you can do where you can start getting some critical thinking around certain ideas. But it's a very different culture.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So what have you seen in terms of gender effects or the Me Too movement in terms of some of these dynamics?
So in the survey aspect of our research, so we've surveyed about 4,000 employees from hundreds of organizations across various countries and all hierarchical levels so far. It's an ongoing survey that we're doing. And there is, there is a statistical gender effect in some of the work that we're looking at. So women are less confident at speaking up. They expect worse consequences of speaking up. They value the opinion of others more. Mm-hmm. So that's what and none of those are an enormous surprise.
Right.
It's a bit depressing in terms of, that we are still within we're still socially constructing gender in a certain way that means that it can be experienced as more difficult to speak up as a woman. But so there are gender effects. And one thing that organizations can do if they are wanting people to speak up more is that they can start looking and remain looking at gender bias and gender discrimination. In terms of the Me Too campaign, I mean that's a really good example of how collective speaking up has actually been facilitated through technology as well, and that's one thing we examine briefly in the book. Is in what ways will technology enable people to speak up about certain subjects? And one thing that happened there, it becomes less risky to speak up if you can do that with allies and collectively. And that's one thing that technology can really assist with. And there is we've got a long way to go to help people to speak up more about sexual harassment than they have done already.
What do you think the future is going to bring in this area of speaking up? I guess you can tie this further into technology or just more broadly. Where do you see things heading?
Okay, so one thing before I get on the technology, I'm becoming very interested in employee activism and how people speak up about issues that they are passionate about at work. So one thing that's quite interesting is that there's many organizations now on a mission to help people to speak up. And a mission, you've probably heard this phrase as well, a mission to help people to bring their whole selves to work.
Right.
The kind of idea of, no, bring it in, we want to see you all. and then
probably not the whole self, probably just part of it.
well, this is it, that we are seeing a few examples of organizations kind of going, no, speak up. Oh, don't speak up about that, please. or
Yeah.
bring your whole self apart from that bit. So I think, in terms of where the future's heading, it's going to be quite interesting as organizations navigate the consequences of the invitation to speak up and challenge. So that's one thing. The second thing is in relation to technology. I think technology has the potential to really improve the way that we're able to speak up and listen and hear alternative voices, and it's got the potential to silence and allow us to retreat into echo chambers like never before. So,
How would it silence people?
I think through various algorithms, for example, that enable us to hear certain voices that match with our own rather than seek others. I think we can see that on social media quite significantly. Sure. And the other way is, more and more of our conversations at work are recorded in one way or another. And we know that.
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal just did a really interesting piece on the amount of employee surveillance that's going on.
Yeah, so I think some of us are sort of a bit naive about that at the moment. But when we realise that what we say is there forevermore, and not only that, who knows, in the future, maybe what we say is sifted through to judge us in terms of whether we're sticking to corporate values or not. It's quite likely that silences. It's possible that people start to play a political game via the technology by saying certain things and not saying other things. So there are certainly ways that I can see that technology can help, but definitely ways that they could silence also.
All right. Well, I think we should probably call this a day. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me, Jeff.
All right. This was great. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.